She does that. I'd like to put it in some kind of context, and perhaps if I could have the laptop feed up, guys, that would be great. Fantastic. We're looking at the book of Daniel on Sunday mornings at the moment, and we're calling it The Quest, Pursuing Spiritual Excellence. And as we come to look at Daniel chapter 5, I want to call it God's Graphologist. You see, graphologists are a controversial breed. They claim to be able to detect what the author was thinking at the time he or she was writing something on a piece of paper. Now, for every person who thinks this works, there's someone else who thinks it doesn't. But actually, this is what Daniel is doing in chapter 5, and Sandy's going to read the story to us in a moment. So just to put it in some kind of context, the whole message of the book of Daniel is that God is sovereign. You look at Daniel chapter 1, Daniel refused the king's food and proved that God was sovereign. In Daniel chapter 2, Daniel was given, or Nebuchadnezzar, the king, was given a dream, and he asked somebody to tell him what that dream was and interpret it on pain of death, and the message was, God is sovereign. In Daniel chapter 3, we have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego going into the burning fiery furnace, and 3 men went in, 3 men came out, but there were 4 men in the fire. And the message of that is God is sovereign. In Daniel chapter 4, we saw Nebuchadnezzar reduced to a pitiful man wandering the fields without any kind of guidance or leadership at all because he'd rejected God. And then he came to his senses and he realized not just that God is sovereign out there, but he's my sovereign. Message of Daniel chapter 4, God is sovereign. Now, that's a kind of a hint to spot what we're going to see in Daniel chapter 5. Sandy, would like to read it, says, thank you.
The writing on the wall. King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines might drink from them. So they brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines drank from them. As they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Suddenly, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his legs became weak and his knees were knocking. The king summoned the enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. Then he said to these wise men of Babylon, "Whoever reads this writing and tells me what it means will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around his neck, and he will be made the 3rd highest ruler in the kingdom." Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or tell the king what it meant. So King Belshazzar became even more terrified, and his face grew more pale. His nobles were baffled. The queen, hearing the voices of the king and his nobles, came into the banquet hall. "May the king live forever," she said. "Don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale. There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your father, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. Your father, King Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. He did this because Daniel, whom the king, your father, called Belteshazzar, was found to have a keen mind and knowledge and understanding, and also the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve difficult problems. Call for Daniel, and he will tell you what the writing means." So Daniel was brought before the king, and the king said to him, "Are you Daniel, one of the exiles my father the king brought from Judah? I have heard that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that you have insight, intelligence, and outstanding wisdom. The wise men and enchanters were brought before me to read this writing and tell me what it means, but they could not explain it. Now I have heard that you are able to give interpretations and to solve difficult problems. If you can read this writing and tell me what it means, you will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around your neck, and you will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom." Then Daniel answered the king, "You may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means. Your Majesty, the Most High God gave your father, Nebuchadnezzar, sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. Because of the high position he gave him, all the nations and peoples of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted. And those he wanted to humble, he humbled. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. He was driven away from people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like the ox, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and sets over them anyone he wishes. But you, Belshazzar, his son, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this. Instead, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from his temple brought to you, and you and your nobles, your wives, and your concubines drank wine from them. You praised the gods of silver and gold and bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which cannot see or hear or understand. But you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. Therefore he sent the hand that wrote the inscription. This is the inscription that was written: Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. Here is what these words mean. Mene, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Then, at Belshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed in purple, a gold chain was placed around his neck, and he was proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
That's quite some story, isn't it? And as we look at it today, what I want to do is to try and tease out what God is saying through this particular passage. Now, we've already been noticing that God is sovereign is one of the big messages of the book of Daniel. Actually, just before we go any further, would you like to take your news sheet, this one? You'll find it's got lots of information about the church this week. And inside, somewhere, yes, right in the middle, there's an outline of this morning's teaching. So you can take a pen that's also in the seat and you can jot down a few notes, or you can do a doodle. The choice is yours. So everything that comes up on the screen, you can fill in here, and anything else you want to make a note of. Wonderful. And we can see that there is a huge difference between saying God is sovereign in some kind of abstract or philosophical sense and saying God is my sovereign. That's the difference that we're going to see in a moment between Nebuchadnezzar, the early king, and Belshazzar, the later king. Now, actually, although we have the word father in our English versions, the Aramaic word that's behind that can be interpreted just as ancestor. And when we look at archaeology, we find that Belshazzar wasn't actually Nebuchadnezzar's son, he was in fact his grandson. And in between the two of them, there's a man called Nabonidus, who is actually the king of Babylon at the time. And when this happened, he was away in Arabia. He actually stayed away from the nation for nearly 10 years, and he was away there, and he had put Belshazzar in his place in Babylon. So Belshazzar is not actually the king of Babylon. He's kind of acting up as king. The real king is elsewhere, but he's been entrusted with that responsibility. And what we're going to see is a huge contrast between Belshazzar in chapter 5 and Nebuchadnezzar, chapter 4. If you were here last week, you'll know that we saw the way that man's life turned around and he acknowledged that the Lord is sovereign. There's a huge difference between knowing that God is sovereign in a sort of abstract or philosophical sense and saying that he is my sovereign in a personal sense. I bow to his authority. I listen out for his voice. And actually, that is the beating heart of the Christian faith. He is my king. You become a Christian not by being born in a Christian country, not by going to church, although hopefully church will help you in that quest. You don't become a Christian by being born in a Christian family, although if your parents are good examples, that will help you. Actually, being born in a Christian family doesn't make you a Christian any more than being born in McDonald's makes you a hamburger. I mean, you get the idea. Because fundamentally, Christianity is not a religion. Religion has to do with rule keeping. It has to do with keeping up, making sure I'm on the right side of God. It has to do with appeasing God. Christianity has to do with a relationship. He is my king. So knowing about God being sovereign and knowing that he is my sovereign are two very different things. Nebuchadnezzar found that. Belshazzar didn't. And we're going to spot that as we go through. So let's just have a short think about Belshazzar and seek to understand who he was. And the question I want to ask about Belshazzar is, why was his behavior so bad, and does it really matter? And since little things mean something, I want this to be in the middle so I can have my notes on here. And we can say by our architecture that the word is central. Right, Belshazzar. Why was his behavior so bad, and does it really matter? The reason God's judgment came down on Belshazzar so heavily all has to do with goblets. Now, I've got a goblet here, actually. This is called a keep cup. And it was, given to me by a well-known Christian charity, who I won't name because I don't want to embarrass Tear Fund. And it came to me, and on the packaging I noticed that what they say about this goblet is, this is the original reusable coffee cup. Are you seriously asking me to believe that no one has ever reused a coffee cup before? And this is the original one? Because if it is, I'm going to keep it on my shelf and treasure it. This all has to do with reusable cups and the use to which those cups were put. This one is set apart for the drinking of coffee. The goblets that Belshazzar were using were set apart for the worship of God. Now, in Nebuchadnezzar's era, in his ancestors' era, they had stolen the vessels from the temple, these goblets, and, quote, put them in the treasury in Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar was acquiring wealth. He was stealing stuff and taking it to himself. Belshazzar took this one step further and brought these goblets out of the treasury to be used for their intended purpose, which is for worship. But this wasn't the worship of the living God. This was the worship of gods of wood and stone and iron and marble and so on. So the holy became the commonplace. The sacred became the profane. And God's name is being rubbished. More than that, Belshazzar's name is being elevated. He's using them to bolster his reputation. Look how great I am, he's saying effectively. These worship goblets are used in a toast to me. I called this party. Long live the king. Even his wife had to say that. It would be rather like the Korean leader Kim Jong-un turning up at one of his lavish military festivals and using the British crown jewels, carrying our orb and our scepter, wearing our crown. You see, these artifacts that Belshazzar was using were the crown jewels of faith in God in the 6th century BC. So Belshazzar is sending out a powerful message. God is subservient to me. I'm the one who's in command. Now, I'd like us just to take a short moment here to look at how Daniel is written. And this may at first hearing sound rather technical, but it does have something to tell us. You see, chapters 2 to 7 of the book of Daniel are written not in Hebrew like most of the rest of the Old Testament. They're written in Aramaic, and it's the biggest chunk of Aramaic we have in the Old Testament. And the fact that it's written in this one language tells us to look at it in its own right. It's probably a chunk of text we're to interpret by itself, or at least to look at it separately. And if we look at the chapters, we see a very interesting thing happening. If you look at chapter 7, or chapter 2, for example, what we have in chapter 2 is a dream from King Nebuchadnezzar about 4 kingdoms. And Daniel interprets that dream. Those of you who were here a few weeks ago will remember, maybe you won't, that we were talking about that. Hey, wait a minute, look at Daniel 7, and what you see is another dream and an interpretation relating to 4 empires. We are intended to spot the similarity. Well then, what about chapter 6? In chapter 6, this is where we get Daniel in the lion's den. We're going to see how God delivers his servants. That's the message of it. He's sovereign and he's able to get his people out of trouble sometimes. Okay, well now look at chapter 3. And what do we have? We have Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego in the burning fiery furnace, and God gets them out. Same message, God delivers his servants. Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego in chapter 3 and Daniel in chapter 6. So now what about chapter 5 we're reading today? This is a proud king, Belshazzar. That's what the B stands for there, because I didn't have room enough for his name. He is a proud king, setting himself up against God and not acknowledging that he's sovereign. What have we got in chapter 4? We've got another proud king, Nebuchadnezzar. But in his case, he did acknowledge that God was sovereign by the end of the chapter. Now, can you see the pattern here? We call it a chiastic shape. In fact, I was joking with the prayer meeting earlier on. I said, I'm going to be speaking about the chiastic shape of the Aramaic text this morning. And they all laughed at me. So there you are. It's called a chiastic shape. It's like a sandwich. And in ancient writing, and there's a lot of this in the Old Testament. If you want a little exercise in the Old Testament, see if you can spot chiastic shapes. Look at Psalm 1. And don't look for highfalutin interpretations of the verses. Just go for the straight text and you'll spot a chiasm in Psalm 1. A little bit of homework for you. This is a very common form of writing in ancient times, particularly in the Old Testament. And what it does is it says the most important thing, the big message, the message to take away from this is in the center. It's the jam in the sandwich. So we are intended by this piece of Aramaic text to look at the comparison between these two proud kings, Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar, because they are different. And even the compiler of the text wrote that into the way he put it. So what are the differences and the similarities? Well, if we look at both of these kings, they're both self-opinionated. Nebuchadnezzar had this huge statue of himself built and wanted people to worship it. Belshazzar threw this feast, which was the king's prerogative, not his. Bear in mind, he was acting up as king. Also, Belshazzar had heard God's voice through a dream. Belshazzar sees God's voice in the writing on the wall. And Daniel interpreted both of them. But there are some big differences as well. You see, Nebuchadnezzar looked to heaven and took heed of God's message through Daniel. We saw that last week. Belshazzar defied God's word, defied God's message. Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 4 ended up praising God. Lord, you are my king, he said. Belshazzar profaned the living God and lost his kingdom as a consequence. At the end of their lives, Nebuchadnezzar had his kingdom restored and was looked back on as a man of great integrity and good leadership. At the end of his life, Belshazzar had his kingdom destroyed with breathtaking speed. There's the message of Daniel 5. God is sovereign. So let's ask ourselves, where do we go for insight? Because that was the dilemma that Belshazzar faced. He'd thrown this feast, a powerful statement of opulence and hedonism, and in the midst of all the reveling, some writing appears on the wall, and Belshazzar saw it, and it shook him to the core. The God that Belshazzar believed didn't exist had broken through his pathetic defenses and gained his undivided attention. If you've got Daniel 5 open on your lap, look at verse 5. Suddenly, in an instant, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched as it wrote. The writing appeared by the lampstand, the brightest place at the feast, where the most people would see it. And this suggests that the rest of the feast or the orgy took place in near darkness with plenty of sort of nooks and crannies for people to get up to who knows what. In verse 6, Belshazzar's face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his legs became weak and his knees were knocking. Something lurched in this man's spirit. Something told him, buddy, you can't ignore this. This is the finger of God. What would you do? Where would you go for insight if something like that happened? What did he do? Well, look at verse 7. The king summoned the enchanters and the astrologers and the diviners. These were the so-called wise men of Babylon. And we saw this with Nebuchadnezzar on one occasion. The same thing happens here. Belshazzar sought an occult solution to a spiritual question. And we know that he's looking in the wrong place. If God is speaking, we don't turn to astrology, because that God never speaks through that medium. We don't turn to crystals or reading tea leaves or tarot cards, because those media are not things through which God communicates. But that's the way Belshazzar saw it. He turned for an occult solution to a spiritual question. And as an incentive, he offered high office to the person who manages to interpret the writing. He will be made, he said, the third highest ruler in the kingdom. Did that sound a bit odd when Sandy read it to you earlier on? Why the third highest ruler? I'll tell you why. Actually, Belshazzar knew very well that he wasn't the king, even though he was pretending to be it. His father was king and his father was away. So the highest honor that Belshazzar could award was not the king, that was Nabonidus, nor was it second in command, that was Belshazzar. He could only offer third in command. So third highest ruler of the kingdom is the highest honor he could bestow. Basically, he's saying whoever comes up with the answer to this can be heir to the throne. And when an occult solution failed to produce results, the queen advised Belshazzar that once upon a time there was a man somewhere in Babylon who used to interpret this kind of thing, and his name's Daniel. His Babylonian name was Belteshazzar, and that comes out at one point in the text. So Daniel is summoned. By this time, Daniel's most likely to be in his 70s, mid-70s. So we're not talking about a young man here. And he comes in as God's messenger. And he sees right through Belshazzar in an instant. Verse 18, but your majesty, the Most High God gave your ancestor Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory until he acknowledged the Most High God. He acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over all kingdoms of the earth and sets over them anyone he wishes. That's the background, that's the context. But you, he says, you, Belshazzar, his son and heir, have not humbled yourself, even though you knew all this. Instead, you've set yourself up against the Lord of heaven and had the goblets from the temple brought to you. You and your nobles and your wives and your harem, they drank wine from them. You praised gods of silver, gold, bronze, iron, wood, stone, you name it, you praised it. And that is why God sent his hand to write this inscription, to show that he is capable of communicating where your gods are not. Sure, Belshazzar knew the transformation that had taken place in Nebuchadnezzar. So Daniel told him the meaning of the writing. 3 simple words: Mene, Tekel, and Upharsin. Perez, depending on the way you read the Aramaic text. Mene means weighed. Mene means numbered. Tekel means weighed, and Upharsin means divided. So Daniel's message to the king was, God's message was, numbered, weighed, divided. That's your kingdom. The length of your life is divinely appointed. Weighed, the achievements of your life are divinely assessed. Divided, the Medes and Persians are at your door, and archaeology tells us that they were waiting around the city to take it, and this was the night that it happened. The writing is on the wall whenever evil triumphs, as it did in Belshazzar's reign, as it did in Manchester this week for just a split second. The writing is on the wall when God is suppressed, when young children are prevented from reading the Bible and hearing about God, about the God who loves them. I was talking to someone who works with the Gideons, and they give out Bibles to children at school. And there's some resistance to their work. And his argument was, these children need the evidence. They need to be able to make a decision for themselves. You cannot suppress a particular book, even though there were questions being asked as to whether the Gideons should do it. So, in the light of all this, we're going to change our main message ever so slightly. The main message, again, you can make a note of this in your news sheet, is God is sovereign, whether we acknowledge him or not. God is sovereign, whether we acknowledge him or not. God is our judge, whether we like it or not. Now, we don't like thinking of God as a judge. We prefer him to be a nice, sort of loving teddy bear kind of character, rather than an impartial magistrate. But if he is our judge, then what can we do about it? The amazing, the almost unbelievable aspect of the Christian gospel is that we can see alongside God's judgment that he himself has paid the penalty that we are due. Judgment, yes, but the penalty has been paid. And that's the significance of the death and the resurrection of Christ. That was the penalty being paid. Let me illustrate it with my rather overloaded file of facts. I want you to imagine that this is you, and the things that deserve God's punishment, God's assessment, was a negative assessment on us, deserve punishment. The wrong things, the stuff on the shadow side of our life. The Bible calls it sin. I mean, we all know it's there. We don't like to admit it because we like to think that we're all nice people. You are very nice people, but on the shadow side, there's some stuff there. And that stuff is represented by my book. And because my book is there, I can't have a relationship with God. This is a barrier. It's in the way. But what Christ did is he took that on himself. So that whereas at one time Christ had an open relationship with God, there wasn't any barrier, anything getting in the way. What he allowed to happen on the cross was that my wrongdoing and yours was taken by him, so that I am now free to have a relationship with God. So, yes, God is my judge, but he's taken my penalty. And that means that I want to say to him, Lord, you are my king. I want you as sovereign. That's the kind of sovereign that I want. If this is what being a Christian is about, then I want to be in on it. In the book of Isaiah, one of the prophets in the Old Testament, he said this: all we like sheep have gone astray. We've turned every one to our own way, but the Lord has laid on him, on his servant, on Christ, the iniquity of us all. God is sovereign, whether we like it or not, whether we admit it or not. But he's also a judge who's paid the penalty already. My friend, if that's new to you, if that could be a life-transforming piece of information to carry around with you. To say, Lord, I want you to be my king. I know there's stuff I need to deal with, and I thank you that you've paid the penalty. Today, I want you to be my king. Or it could be that you've been a Christian for some time, and this kind of stuff has crept back in. And you say, Lord, I want you to take the stuff that's crept back in. I want to be renewed in you. And in a moment, I'm going to lead us in a prayer, and I invite you to say that prayer in your heart. Because as you do that, God will do his work and bring you that transformation of knowing that sin is forgiven, that your relationship is there. Let's bow our heads in a moment's prayer. All we like sheep have gone astray. Lord, that's me. We've turned every one to our own ways. Lord, that's me. But the Lord has laid on him my iniquity. Lord, that's you. Lord, in this moment, as best I can, I open my heart and my mind and my soul to you. Thank you that my penalty has been paid and my relationship with you renewed. In Jesus' name.